Joel, appreciate you joining me today. There's a lot happening in Syria, and we've had you on a number of times to cover sort of the trajectory of what has been happening there with regime change. And you obviously have this new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, who is a former al-Qaeda member and a former extremist. And we use the word former because we've been sort of taking him at his word that he's going to respect minority groups. And it seems right now we have a situation where the government is not quite making good on that. What is happening right now, or what has been happening when it comes to religious minorities there in Syria?
Yeah, Billy, the last week, starting July 13, has really been one of the worst weeks of the entire Syrian civil war, to be honest. There is a region in southern Syria called Suwayda, where the majority of the people living there belong to a religious minority group called the Druzes. And the Druzes have their own militias. They've been controlling their own security ever since the Assad regime collapsed in Syria in December. And in the last week, President al-Sharaa, the new president of Syria, sent his forces to Suwayda to try to occupy the region, to try to take it over. And when they entered the towns of Suwayda, they started killing people and looting people's houses. And this was very clearly religiously driven violence. They were shouting Allahu Akbar, the troops of the new Syrian government. They were calling Druzes infidels, kuffar. They were calling them pigs. I saw some horrible videos I wish I hadn't seen. There's one where government forces go into an apartment and find some Druze men and force them to jump off the balcony of their apartment. And as they're jumping, they shoot each one and then shout Allahu Akbar. So very clearly, this is ideologically driven violence against non-Muslims. And as your viewers and listeners will know, this is not the first time this has happened in the last few months. In March, the Syrian government organized the massacre of between 1,000 and several thousand members of another religious minority group, the Alawites. So President al-Sharaa continues to say in public the right things, but it's getting more and more ridiculous to take him at his word for anything.
Well, and then the natural next question, right? You have these minority groups that we're talking about, and then you have Christians, and there have been a lot of questions about what will happen to Christians in this dynamic. Let's talk a little bit about that. Are we seeing any sort of restriction on Christians in particular? We know they're going after other minority groups. And we'll get into the fact that there was an evangelical preacher who was killed. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in a general sense, is there a structural attack on Christians that we're seeing yet in Syria?
Not yet. And the Syrian government seems to know that that would provoke a really big reaction from Europe and from the United States. And right now they really need development aid from the United States and from Europe, even to make the country work. So they're holding off on the Christians for now. But our friends in Syria tell us that daily life is getting a lot more uncomfortable for Christians. The government has banned most kinds of swimwear at the beach. The women have to cover themselves completely. The government is cracking down on the sale of alcohol, which of course is something that Christians tend to do in Syria as opposed to Muslims. And security forces on the street in Syria are mostly former members of this terrorist group called HTS, which was once al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. And they will sometimes, on their own authority, tell women who haven't covered their hair, Christian women, that they have to cover their hair. Or they'll see a couple walking together and forcibly separate them, or even arrest them for being together in public. There aren't laws allowing them to do these things, they simply do them. And that's happening more and more often. So the environment for Christians is getting much worse. And of course, just a few weeks ago, just a month ago, actually, we had the worst massacre of Christians at a church service in the history of Syria, I think. So between 25 and 30 Christians were murdered when a suicide bomber attacked their church in Damascus. And President al-Sharaa refused to call the victims of this attack martyrs. He refused to attend the funeral, and he refused to visit the church. These are extremely serious bad signals to the Christian community.
Well, and you look a lot at persecution and trends, and obviously there's direct government persecution, but then you have, if the government sort of turns a blind eye, looks the other way, people become empowered to do things like that suicide bombing, right? Oh, well, this guy went and did this and these people died and nobody said anything. Well, then we can start to do these things as well and nobody's going to say anything or stop us. I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all, but that's another element of this. If the government doesn't do it directly, their inadequacy in dealing with it can then empower other forms of persecution in the community.
Absolutely. That's absolutely what's happening now in Syria. Yes.
So, just to go back to the Druzes for a minute, for those who don't know the tension point there, what they believe and why they would be, just to kind of, I think it's important maybe we talk a little bit about that so people understand what it is that would make them a target.
So Druzes are an offshoot of Islam. They emerged around the 11th century, and they believe in one God, and they might call themselves Muslims depending on who you ask, but there's very little that we would recognize as Muslim about them. They drink alcohol, they believe in reincarnation, they refuse to marry people from other Muslim groups, they only marry within themselves, within their own community. So they are not a typical religious group for the Middle East, we can say. And in the jihadist worldview, there are three types of people. There are Muslims, there are so-called people of the book, Christians and Jews, who have the wrong religion, but at least they're following scriptures that were revealed by God at some point in the Islamic worldview. But Druzes and Alawites are the third category. These are either pagans or heretics. These are people who have rejected the truth, who are not following any divine revelation. And in the jihadist worldview, these are people who can and should be killed and enslaved. And that's why throughout the Syrian civil war, we saw the worst violence from jihadists against Alawites and Druzes and Yazidis in Iraq, another group that fits into that category. So that is what's underlying this sort of extreme violence against Druze civilians when government troops go into their towns.
No, that's really helpful for the context to help people understand why this might be happening. Now, another story that I know CSI has covered is this evangelical pastor. He was the pastor of Good Shepherd Evangelical Church, and his name was Khalid Mazhar. What do we know about this? I mean, this is a pretty shocking story of his murder.
We're still putting together the details on what exactly happened, but we know that Pastor Khalid Mazhar was attacked by armed fighters sometime last week in Suwayda city. He and his wife and his children and several other of his relatives, 12 people in all, were all killed. And there's a 13th person who survived only because they thought that she was dead, basically. And this, again, the Druzes were the main target here, but this is something that we saw as well in March during the massacres on the coast, is that when these government fighters go into a place and start killing all the Alawites or killing all the Druzes, sometimes they kill Christians as well. If they come across a Christian, that happens. That happened in March and apparently happened now. So this violence is not something that can be restricted to one community. It's going to spread, and it's going to affect Christians as well.
Well, and especially, again, if there's no punishment or you don't fear any punishment for it, what is killing another member of a different minority group if you're already going after another one, right? As a Muslim extremist, I don't think it's going to matter much whether they're Druze, member of the Druzes or Christians. They're going to potentially go after them. How can people be praying right now for Syria? I mean, there's so many different elements from the government level down to the people in these minority groups.
Yeah, I mean, I try to pray for President Bashar every day. We're supposed to pray for our leaders. And if he were to have a change of heart, that would really make a big difference in Syria. But we also need to be praying, I think, for the leaders in the United States. For some reason, President Trump and his administration have really put all their chips on Ashara, on this former al-Qaeda commander. The reason the attack stopped last week is that Israel started bombing Damascus, started bombing Syrian government forces and forced them to retreat. And this week we're seeing all these reports in the news that President Trump is very angry with Israel for bombing Ashara. The U.S. Special Envoy to Syria is also saying things like, what happened in Suwayda was very sad, but we need Syrian troops to deploy to Suwayda. And I'm not entirely sure why they're so convinced that this former Al-Qaeda commander is going to deliver for them, but they're wrong. And we need them to come to that realization sooner rather than later. If the Druzes are going to be safe, if Christians are going to be safe in Syria, we need accountability from President Bashar for these atrocities.
Well, and if Bashar needs things from America and other nations, there's some sway there then as well. This is the same issue with Nigeria that we've talked about when, we have the ability and the sway and the power to move things. And when I say we, I mean America, then America should be doing those things to protect these minority groups. Where can people go to get more information on these stories? I know CSI does a great job of updating and writing. Where can they go to do that?
It would be great if you could visit our website. It's www.csi-usa.org. We'll have updates there about Syria, also different ways you can engage with our ministry and support persecuted Christians around the world.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time and joining me today, as always.
Thank you, Billy.